Chapter 15. Science the shit out of it. Quote, I learned a long time ago the wisest thing I can do is be on my own side, be an advocate for myself and others like me. Maya Angelou. There's a great line from the movie The Martian starring Matt Damon. On one of my low days, I stumbled upon this movie. I found deep inspiration from it. There's one line that compelled me to literally sit up and say yes. It came at a time in the movie where Matt Damon's character, having been stranded on Mars, is about to run out of food and water. He looks defeated and scared, but suddenly it's as if he remembers who he is. A scientist, a fearless innovator who's gone into space. He says to himself, okay, I'm going to science the shit out of this. In that moment, I realized that while there was more support and information for those suffering from med injury and or benzodiazepine withdrawal syndrome than ever before, I was still kind of out there in medical no man's land. No one was going to show up, roll up their sleeves, and say, Jennifer, you're too special to let wither away. We're going to figure this out, come hell or high water. Yes, I had many people who cared and were concerned. Still, at that moment, I realized I needed to be like Matt Damon's character in The Martian. And recalling another favorite movie quote, I needed to get busy living or get busy dying, said by Morgan Freeman's character Red in The Shawshank Redemption. So I got busy sciencing the shit out of myself. While I needed to summon the troops, my support systems, I first needed to acknowledge that I was the captain of those troops. This was my mission, and it was up to me. So again, I can't offer medical advice, but here are some things I learned as I scienced the shit out of myself. Number 1, be your own advocate, ask the questions, do the research. In my research about struggling to come off the Xanax, I stumbled upon a detail that made my blood run cold. Professor Ashton, years before, cautioned using fluoroquinolone antibiotics while either taking or withdrawing from benzos. As you can imagine, this point grabbed my interest. While I'd not been on a benzo back in 2016 when I was given the antibiotic, I had used a very small dose just 2 weeks before getting floxed. For years, if I had a long flight, I used a tiny dose of Xanax to help with flight anxiety and motion sickness. While the benzo should have been long out of my system, it was interesting to read an article written by Brad Verrett about the risks of interaction between that class of antibiotics and benzos. He speculated that this particular class of antibiotic could potentially strip the GABA A receptor site, thus throwing patients into acute benzo withdrawal. My symptoms of being floxed were nearly identical to that of someone going through acute benzo withdrawal. Yet not one of the 7 specialists in 2016, nor any number of the doctors I saw in 2020, made or saw any possible connection. I had also learned that taking NSAIDs, Motrin and Advil, while taking a fluoroquinolone could lead to adverse reactions. Remember my hairdresser who took an NSAID for a headache and woke up in a world of hurt? Neither the doctor at the urgent care center nor the pharmacist asked me if I was taking a benzo or using an NSAID when I was prescribed the antibiotic. While I wasn't taking the former, I had taken large doses of the latter, the NSAIDs, to combat a fever both the day I started the antibiotic and for a few days following. Did taking that small dose of Xanax 8 days before the antibiotic leave me more vulnerable to having an adverse reaction? Had I been given informed consent about the interactions with benzos or NSAIDs, I would have opted out of taking that antibiotic. While I'm not advocating to turn to Dr. Google, as that alone can lead you down endless rabbit holes, I am advocating for slowing down, doing some research, and asking all the questions you need in order to provide fully informed consent. Even then, it may still not save you from being a 3 to 5%er. Doctors aren't gods, and there are always outliers. But after listening to and reading thousands of personal accounts of these 3 to 5%ers, the supposed outliers, I have realized that I need to do my very best to make sure I know what I'm putting in my body. We have to be our own advocates and have someone we trust to act as one if we cannot. Until I ran into the gem of an ENT, each specialist I saw told me, I've heard of spontaneous tendon ruptures and things like that, but nothing like you're suggesting. First of all, not suggesting, experiencing. Second, had my doctor or pharmacist said, okay, I can write you a script for something, but you need to know there's a black box warning about spontaneous tendon ruptures, I can tell you that I would have taken my sore throat and headache home or asked for something else. Not to mention, by the time I ingested those 3 toxic pills in September of 2016, the FDA Advisory Committee had deemed it too risky a medication for the very thing that it was prescribed me for. There were even 2 black box warnings indicating the potential to develop the very symptoms I experienced. In March of 2020, a few months following the surgery that kicked off my second episode, I was off work. I had just shut down my practice due to my extreme reaction to starting a rapid taper of Xanax. I was trying to make myself walk. At the time, I was having a few good hours where I could leave the house. While I walked around the neighborhood feeling intermittently terrified that I might dissociate and get lost, I found myself hitting one of those angry moments. I went home and decided to contact 12 pharmacies in the surrounding area. I asked to speak to the pharmacist and said that I had a sinus infection, had gone to an urgent care center, and was given a prescription for levofloxacin, the generic form of Levaquin. Told them I didn't know much about the medication and was leery of taking things. I asked if they thought it was that it was appropriate for sinus infections and what I needed to know about contraindications with any over-the-counter medications. One of the 12 pharmacists told me, absolutely not. This is like taking a fire extinguisher to put out a candle. They told me about the tendon ruptures. 2 others had mentioned this too, but said it was very rare. This particular pharmacist, though, went on to ask me if I was on any other meds, specifically a benzodiazepine. You can imagine who my new pharmacist is now, right? But I was dumbstruck. Granted, this is not a gold standard empirically based experiment by any means. However, only 1 in 12 pharmacists pumped the brakes, gave me accurate information, and was uncomfortable filling the script. We cannot assume that we will be provided with the information we need to make an informed decision. It is up to us to ask again, and research. I am not insinuating that doctors are purposely withholding information to keep us from having informed consent. I don't think any doctor, whether they were able to help me or not, was coming from a place of malice. However, having many doctor friends, I am acutely aware of how challenging it is right now to practice medicine these days. The pressure to see a certain number of patients, as well as the litigiousness of our society, creates the expectation for them to be gods and not to make any mistakes. Being expected by your medical group or hospital to see 40 to 60 patients a day makes it nearly impossible to slow down and thoroughly review with each patient the possible adverse and black box warnings on each medication being prescribed. In fact, many of the physicians I saw in my clinical practice as a therapist were struggling to keep up in their lives given the near superhuman demands placed on them by the institutions that employed them. In addition, many adverse reactions occur in the minority of individuals taking a particular medication. I am sure many more people are helped by fluoroquinolones, nerve meds, and benzos than harmed by them. However, this brings me to a larger question that I have for the medical community. How many narratives and anecdotal stories have to rack up for it to become empirically based evidence? Many of the specialists I consulted said there's just anecdotal evidence, meaning there's just people's stories. But when you look at these groups and see patterns of debilitating symptoms affecting hundreds of thousands of people, then at what point are there enough stories to become worthy of being considered and counted as science? Number 2, ask your doctor about genetic testing. Some great tools available offer a blueprint to help our doctors and us identify the best meds for us. There are many, but I use the Genomind testing to obtain information about psychotropic medications that I might have a harder time metabolizing, or that might cause an adverse response. Through the testing, I learned Valium, often used as a substitute for Xanax in a taper, was not a good fit for me. This is not to say that my genetic profile would have told me how I would have reacted to a fluoroquinolone, but it offers a great deal of information about how we metabolize medications, which can help your team identify the best path forward specific to your body. If you've been injured by a medication, it is imperative to find a team that both believes you and is willing to work with you. For example, the psychiatrist in 2020 recognized I was very ill from the combination of surgery, discontinuing gabapentin cold turkey, and my benzodiazepine rapid taper. She slowed me down to build my body back up with nutrition and supplements before we resumed a slow and steady benzo taper. She was open to hearing the input and advice my internist was offering. I would often send emails to both to keep them updated and on the same page. I know I got lucky. I know how hard it is to find a doctor, let alone a team, that can invest the amount of time needed to get to the bottom of our challenging situation. Join online groups and ask if there are doctors in your city or area that someone else found helpful. If I hadn't kept pushing and looking, I wouldn't have found my team. It is very challenging while sick to have to push so hard, and to even say no thank you to well-meaning clinicians when they advise us to do things that we feel are not in our best interest.